welcome to the latest ECIST podcast. My name is Karla Parker and I'm the Head of Business Improvement in the ECIST team. Today I'm joined by Adam Sewell Jones. Adam, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, as you've heard, I'm Adam Sewell Jones. I'm currently the interim chief executive at Newham University Hospital, and previously I had strong links with ECIST because they were part of my team when I was the executive director improvement at NHS Improvement.
And do you want to tell us a bit more about your background and what you're doing now?
Yeah, sure. So I'm an NHS lifer. I describe myself as a recovering finance director. So my initial training was as an accountant and also did some general management roles in medicine and then become a CFO and for a while the coup at Basildon and Thurrock hospitals. And then about 6 years ago, I guess it was, I joined Monitor for a brief period before they became NHS Improvement as the executive director of provider sustainability, and then became the director of improvement. Then I left there probably 2 years ago now, and after some time out, joined Newham back in last April, just after the pandemic started. So I've been here for just coming up to a year, and haven't known anything other than working in a pandemic environment. So it's been odd. I say to people that since I've been here, I've only shaken hands with one person, and that was a reflex action when I was introduced to them. So it's very odd working with a team for a year and not actually having been able to shake their hand.
Yeah, it must be so odd. It's so hard to get out of the habits that we're used to, and traditionally the way in which we greet each other and talk to each other and the proximity we might have with each other. It's probably worth me saying that Adam and I used to work together at NHS Improvement too. I worked in Adam's team as well, so it's always great to be speaking to you and hearing about what you're doing and your NHS life experience.
Likewise.
So I guess when we worked together, a lot of the work we did was around improvement and continuous improvement. And I wonder if you'd like to just tell us a little bit about managing or balancing continuous improvement with the daily operations, especially now, like you say, working in a pandemic.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting point and something that's quite dear to me, really, because I think and whilst it's a very sensible framing of this tension, I think it's a bit of a false polarity, if you like, between continuous improvement and daily operations. The reality is the kind of genesis of what we know as quality improvement methodology came from daily operations. So back to kind of Deming's time and Duran, this was in kind of factory industry in the States and in Japan. It wasn't what we've maybe considered it often to be in the NHS as some of this soft and fluffy end. And I don't in any way take away from the good work that's been done. But for me, the real power of continuous improvement is when it's the way stuff is done within an organisation rather than applied to particular projects. However, I understand behind the question there is some of that tension between the way the NHS has often worked in an operational basis and the kind of target-driven, sometimes I would argue overly heavy performance management that doesn't create a continuous improvement culture. And for me, I guess that's another point in it. We often think about the QI tools rather than the mindset. And I think that's the big game changer when an organisation really understands an improvement kind of mindset and culture rather than applies a set of tools, although hugely important. So I think the challenge, and particularly in a chief executive role, providing air cover for people when maybe the regulatory system isn't always as you'd wish it to be, and there's lots of really great people working in that and trying to kind of move this work forward, but sometimes the short-term nature of achieving targets or unacceptable failures when actually we should be approaching it from a kind of this is a fantastic opportunity to learn. So there is some real tension there, but in some respects you have to show some personal resilience. You have to protect those who work for you to allow them to work in a slightly different way maybe than some of us have been brought up within the NHS to work.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because certainly from my perspective, having worked in primary care and then coming to central bodies like an SHA and then NHS England and NHS Improvement, I'm always thinking about how does it really, fit within the people on the ground, those who are really making change and continuous improvement happen for the benefit of the patients and the people that we all want to serve. So it's really interesting when you talk about those things. I wonder if you've got any reflections on how we've been able to continue and improve during a pandemic, and maybe some thoughts about trying to implement some of those improvement mindsets or techniques, especially when all of the NHS staff are under so much pressure.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I think there's some kind of tension in this. I think the real value of the pandemic to kind of quality improvement work is that it's felt like we've all had a shared purpose. So anyone in a senior role within a provider knows there's a real battle to get through a huge dashboard of metrics, whether it's externally regulated ones or internal ones. But actually, the conversations have all been about how do we respond to COVID? So how do we deal with what's arriving tomorrow? Because certainly in this hospital, we've had to triple intensive care. At one stage, we only had one ward that was not COVID. Every other ward was full of COVID patients. We've then had to flip those at various times when we've gone up and down the curves of the particular waves. So it's allowed us to have a real kind of shared purpose, focusing on quality, which I think has been very powerful. And one of the things that's come through that change has happened very quickly. So in continuous improvement, we'll often talk about rapid improvement weeks, or preparing lots of information in terms of data before we start to make changes, getting people together in a room. It can be quite a slow process, and don't get me wrong, there's real value in that because it's the way you get good outcomes. But in this instance, we haven't had that opportunity. We've had to make changes in the spur of the moment. So the risk is something we make changes, but they're not real improvements because we've not been kind of true to the method, as it were, in terms of tracking and understanding and making sure that we've not got balancing measures that are going out in different directions. So it's been a risk, but what it has done, I think, in terms of the improvement mindset, one of the big challenges for leadership is that we are expected by many to have all the answers. And one of the really important things in the mindset is senior leaders shouldn't be solving problems. They should be framing problems for the real experts, who are the people, at the interface with patients. And that's, I think, going back to your point around the regulators and the national bodies, that's why it's really difficult to do a lot of this work there, because the further you are away from the patient, the more difficult it is to really impact lots of that change. So I think that's the downside, is we've not necessarily done everything properly. The upside is there's been some real energy, and it's allowed leaders, because they've been dealing with something that no one in the NHS has really dealt with before, probably more of a willingness to say, I don't know the answer to this. So you can show some vulnerability, and you can bring people into often the actual room, or if not the virtual room, to say, how are we going to progress this? So I've just seen a massive opportunity to get people not afraid to suggest ideas, even if they're bad ones, when they're analysed. So I think we've seen a real shift in some of that kind of continuous improvement mindset, even if we've probably not applied some of the tools as rigorously as we should be doing, when we return to some kind of normal.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really refreshing to kind of hear that people have felt empowered to be able to come and try and make changes, because we've had no choice. Like you say, we're all fighting the same fight. And it's how do we try and make improvement? And those, perhaps people have had a seat around the table, the virtual table, that perhaps wouldn't have thought they could or hadn't had the opportunity to before. So yeah, no, that's really refreshing to kind of hear, especially when you're in a regulatory place like I am, when you're in an arm's length body and you feel quite removed at times in how you actually have really meaningful impact, on the ground.
In many respects, Karla, my reason for leaving the world of national bodies to get back into hospital is because I really missed improvement in a practical sense. Really lucky to spend time with people like Don Berwick and Gary Kaplan and people who really kind of led this stuff. But I would meet, for example, with the Virginia Mason chief executives every month and be quite jealous that they were going back to apply this. But I think the really important thing is some of the features of an improvement mindset really sit very well, particularly at regional level. So one of the expressions I heard coming from the Deming teaching is that leaders should be a coach rather than a policeman. And you see that at local level when, in a performance management structure, people can look up in their organisation and think they're being held to account on everything and it's telling off, rather than how do we coach people to do better rather than blaming them or telling them off for where it's gone wrong. At a regional level, there's a real opportunity for national bodies to be coaches of people, to connect them with others that are doing good stuff, to point them to resources, to hold a mirror to them, rather than a feeling of you're a policeman, because it doesn't really, even at a kind of senior level within a provider, it doesn't encourage you to raise concerns. You want to keep the lid on everything. So it's there's still lots to learn, even when you're feeling a bit remote from the front line, that I think we can all apply that kind of mindset to our work.
Yeah, definitely, completely agree there. So thinking about urgent and emergency care, do you have any top tips in working in an environment of continuous improvement in that space? And particularly, a pandemic's brought that even more to light, but do you have any top tips that would be really helpful?
So there's a risk with top tips you position yourself as an expert, and I'm very clear that I'm not. But some of the things I guess I would play back, particularly from the last year, is that some of the things we've seen at Newham and as part of Barts Health, because we're part of a group of kind of 4 hospitals, 3 of which have kind of got EDs. And during this last year, I think we've seen some really interesting changes. So we had, certainly for the main part of the pandemic, at Newham we had 4 daily huddles. And we brought people together, first one at 8:30 in the morning. And it started with questions, do we have any concerns about safety? And we picked up issues around bed management and flow, but it was very much, what happened last night? Can we make a change? In the early days, it might have been about PPE, or it might have been oxygen levels, or it might have been some of these very practical things. But it was a room full of people. We had to mark out the floor at social distance spacing and whatever, because it became a real group where there was a lot of energy. But what was very powerful is some of the improvement techniques that people were using without realizing it. So visual management became a really powerful thing. So we had NIV patients, so they're aerosol generating, so it's a real concern, and they were on oxygen, and we were maxing out our oxygen in the hospital. So the respiratory physicians were coming to the meeting, knowing exactly the numbers, moving coloured dots on the board, so we could see which of our wards had capacity for more AGP, where we'd maxed out. So no one described or taught them in visual management, but in that room, you could instantly get a feel of how the hospital was running, as well as the markings on the floor, as I say, for people and equipment. So we brought some of that in, and I think people now will just do that without even realising it's a tool. It's just become the way we do things because it added value. The other feature I think that I would encourage people to really think about is this idea that don't just do the wrong thing better, but think about doing kind of the right thing. And so if you think about urgent emergency care, generally we've been in a position where, as a risk of not being joined up in a process, the ambulance service, I'm simplifying this, have been measured on how quickly they get patients to an ED. ED is measured on how quickly they do various things, and then when a bed's available, and it's all kind of broken up. But for many people, coming in on an ambulance is the last thing you want to do. You want to stay at home. You don't like hospitals. You don't want, particularly if there's long waits, to have to be in that process. So we've been using the technology very innovatively, I think, across Barts Health, working with the ambulance service to, when someone does need to be brought into a hospital, if one of our sites is the specialist centre, don't bring them to Whipps Cross to then transfer them to Newham. Take them straight to Newham, because that's where, as a trained professional as our paramedic colleagues are, that's where you can predict they're going to be treated. So we're having working with the ambulance service, we've been able to do some of that. But I think more innovatively, using some of the technology, not least what's been underpinning the virtual outpatients, to say if a paramedic can access an ED consultant with a video consultation, to give them the assurance that say, actually that patient doesn't need to come in, or they can come into a booked appointment tomorrow, or they should go somewhere else. All of a sudden you start to do the right thing, rather than making the ambulance experience a good one, but it's the wrong thing to do, or ED the good one. So again, not necessarily top tips, and I don't in any way profess expertise, but I think a reflection on some of the underpinning principles of continuous improvement that we've seen in a pandemic environment, and I think will now be hardwired into the way we do business going forward, which can only be great for the local population.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, and it would be, be a travesty to not take that learning and continue with that. And I think actually it wouldn't happen because, like you say, it's hardwired now into the, it's gone on so long as well that we've continued to do these things in a different way.
It's hardwired, and it's also delivered by the clinicians. So this was worked through by some of our ED consultants and other clinical colleagues, including those in the ambulance service, over a period of time. It's not an instruction that's come down from the chief executives or NHS England or Department of Health. This is something that they've owned, they've developed, and they've applied PDSA. So the version we have now, even kind of a couple of months, 3 months after it was first started, was very different. It was modelled on one site for a population. The population was expanded once it was tested, rolled out to the other site. So a really good example, even though some people wouldn't have realised they were following through a well-defined tool, they went through the process, supported by some of the continuous improvement teams across Barts Health. We're relatively early on the journey to becoming a real quality improvement organisation, but routinely applying the tools and deploying our continuous improvement staff to some of the real pressing issues over the last year. So it's been a really powerful process.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds incredible, and to hear those things. And I know there are, each different organisation is applying similar strategies and working out what works for them and what doesn't work for them, but in a co-produced way with those who need to be involved in that process, where perhaps they hadn't done that before because the environment wasn't such that they had to.
I think co-produced internally, but also that other feature, as I say, the emergency care pathway is a pathway, and in many systems, including lots of organisations as well as teams, and some of those people have histories where they don't necessarily work brilliantly together, but we've seen some fantastic work with a kind of integrated discharge hub with social care colleagues, the way that, as I say, the ambulance service has engaged with the hospital, community services. So a real sense of co-production across the pathway. Probably still need to do more about the patient voice, and I do think if anything has suffered because of this pace, we've not necessarily worked with patients shaping what we need, and it's relied on people who deal with patients to making some of those assumptions.
Yeah, and perhaps that's part of the next PDSA cycle for some of these things, in bringing in the patient voice safely. I think some of it's to do with safety, isn't it? So that's probably why. But yeah, no, it's been fascinating. Are there any other things that you'd like to talk about on this podcast before we kind of wrap up?
No, I suppose the last thing I would say, and as you know, I can talk all day, but is I think another real feature of this pandemic is the fact that we focus on people's well-being, and it should have never have taken a pandemic to trigger that. In the same way, it shouldn't have taken events of last week for us to worry about women's safety in society, or George Floyd to worry. These things have triggered in the last year some real reactions. But I think what's been very powerful, and again, an underpinning feature, particularly of lean improvement, is respect for people. And I think we've probably been exposed how we've not respected our people well enough in the past. And I really hope with the new focus on people's well-being, it will both make them more effective, give them the tools they need to do the job properly, give them some of that opportunity to de-stress so they can give their best, but also demonstrate a real respect for people and not just treating staff as an asset, which maybe is something we've been guilty of. In human resources, for me, is a term that kind of implies they're just a thing we apply rather than people bringing everything they have because they feel respected, and that respect is kind of reciprocated across the piece. So I think that's another feature, that your point around some of these good things that we need to hold on to with the pandemic. We're going to be left with a legacy of loads of bad stuff in terms of, you know, losing family members and friends and the economic consequences, etc. But we need to hold on to some of these kind of newfound principles that, with hindsight, we should have done a long time ago. But I'm really hoping that this becomes a feature of the way we run our services and lead our services going forward.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, you know how I feel about those sorts of things, but yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The well-being and respect and dignity for the people that are with our staff is so imperative. So I think that's everything. It's been really lovely to talk to you, Adam, as always. And we could probably have done a podcast for an hour, just you and I having a guess about anything. But it's been really nice to hear from you and share your thoughts on urgent emergency care and the pandemic and your experience.
Great, lovely to see you, Carla. You take care
And
of
you
yourself.
take care, Adam. Thanks. Bye.